In this video, we're going to go over tips to help you boost your score on reasoning through language arts passages on the GED, and we're going to focus on a lot of practice questions designed to help boost your reading comprehension, and I'm going to give you some reading comprehension skills and strategy as we go through this to help you get a better score on the GED. Okay, so first we're going to start off with passages and questions. So the first passage says, "Our story starts in the summer of 1860 in the busy city of Baltimore. At that time, babies were usually born at home, not in hospitals. But young Mr. and Mrs. Roger Button had different ideas. They wanted their first baby to arrive in a hospital. Was this one of the reasons for the strange history that I'm going to tell you? I can only describe what happened, then you can decide." Okay, so the first question I'd like you to try to answer is, when and where is the story set? So I put all the text you need to answer the question on the screen here, so you can pause the video and try to figure this out, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so the answer here is, it tells us right off the bat here, the story starts in the summer of 1860 in Baltimore in a busy city. And that's a basic skill of reading fiction, is to always figure out the setting. And when you go into your GED test, whenever you get passages on the RLA section, that whether they be fiction passages, this still applies to nonfiction stuff as well, but especially fiction, you always want to ask yourself, what is the setting? In other words, where's the story taking place and when? And this is really going to help you to, number one, you're probably going to get questions, at least one, about the setting on the test. So if you think about this while you're reading, it'll help you anticipate the question ahead of time. But also, it's going to really help you picture what's going on in the story. So think about it here. If the story was set on a farm in a small town somewhere, wouldn't that give you a whole different mental picture than if the story was set in the middle of a busy city? Well, that's just the point. I want you to always go into reading fiction, and even nonfiction too, if they mention the setting. Go into them looking for the setting so that you can form that mental picture in your head of when and where the story is taking place. Okay, so the second question, and we're still looking at that same exact passage. What is the point of view of the story? A, first person. B, second person. C, third person. So pause the video, try to figure this out, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so the answer here is A, first person. And you have to think about the narrator here. So the narrator is just another word for the person who's telling the story. And we can tell that the person telling the story is writing from a first person point of view. We can tell that because they're using the word I, right? It says, I can only describe what happened. So it's always important to think too, is this in the third person point of view or the first person point of view? Because if there's a narrator telling the story, that person might be biased. That person might be an unreliable narrator, meaning we don't know if we can trust what that person's saying here. Is this, or they might be biased, or they might be lying to us. So depending on if the story is in first person or third person, it can really kind of change how the whole story plays out. So something to keep in mind. Okay, the next question is, how many characters were introduced here in this paragraph? So try your best to pause the video again, look at the text here, and just give me a number, how many characters were introduced here, and also list those characters out. Now, if you want bonus points, I'm just kidding here, but if I could give you bonus points for writing them out, I would, but if you don't feel like writing them out, just list them in your head, that's fine too. Okay, so the answer here, I would say 4, but as long as you got the main 2 here, that's going to be acceptable in this case. So we definitely have Mr. and Mrs. Roger Button. They seem to be, so far, the main characters, although we can't really tell. And there's going to be a baby coming, so we know that the baby is either a character right now, or maybe later on the baby will be a bigger character in the story. Then there's also the narrator, so sometimes the narrator is going to be a character and is going to play an active role in the story. Sometimes the narrator is just kind of there telling the story and doesn't have much to do with it. It's only the first paragraph, so we don't really know yet, but I would say 4, Mr. and Mrs. Button, and then the baby, and then the narrator, but as long as you saw Mr. and Mrs. Button, that's the main 2 that you really had to see here. Okay, so now we'll keep going. The next part says, the Roger Buttons were important people in Baltimore society. They knew every good family in town, and everyone knew them. This was their first baby, so Mr. Button was naturally nervous. He was hoping for a boy so he could send him to Yale College in Connecticut. Mr. Roger Button was a student at Yale when he was a young man. Of course, he wanted his son to follow him there. Okay, so the next question, what does this paragraph tell us about Roger Button? So this is an important skill. It's called metacognition, and basically that's a really fancy, if you want to impress your friends, you could probably use that word metacognition, but really all it means is thinking about thinking. And so it's proven that students who use metacognitive strategies while they're reading are going to often outscore people that don't. And so really what I want to do throughout this quiz here, or whatever you want to call this, practicing, is I want to help you start learning how to improve your reading comprehension by just thinking about what you're reading and asking the right questions. So that's the point of this question here, and this is a strategy you can do as you're on the test. Read those passages on the test, pause every now and then, put things in your own words, just think about what's going on. It's going to help boost your comprehension a lot. And the question here, what does this paragraph tell us about Roger Button? I'd like you to pause, just maybe reread this paragraph if you'd like to. If you already know what it says because you just remember it from a couple seconds ago, that's fine too. But I want you to think of at least 3 ideas. And there's no right or wrong ideas. I just want you to just think about, what is the author telling me? What do I know about Mr. Button so far in the story? Try to come up with at least 3 ideas. So pause the video. It's really important that you do this. And this isn't just something I'm just telling you to do just to waste your time. I don't want to waste my time. I certainly don't want to waste yours. So I'm telling you, this is really going to help you start thinking about, just think more critically and process more deeply as you're reading. And therefore, you'll remember things more, understand better, and get a higher score on the GED. So pause the video, try this out, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so, here are just a couple things I kind of came up with here. One could be wealthy, and the reason I thought that was because, it says the Roger Buttons were important people in Baltimore. They knew everybody in town, so maybe that's because they're wealthy. Maybe they've got, some kind of wealth. Maybe they live in a big house or something like that. Also, maybe he's controlling. The reason I thought this could be is just because it says he's hoping for a boy, so he could send him to Yale just like he did. And so it's, that doesn't necessarily mean he's controlling, but maybe it could be. Maybe he wants to kind of force his son to follow in his footsteps. And then also I thought maybe he took after his own father because he went to Yale as a young man. He wants his son to follow him there. So maybe his dad also went to Yale or something like that. And so maybe it's just a generational thing. Who knows? These could all be completely wrong. But, I really want you to understand here, take away from this question, that whenever information is given to you about a character, there's almost always going to be a reason behind it. All right, especially on passages on the GED test. So I just wanted you to get in the habit of stopping whenever characters are introduced, or especially whenever information is given to you about a character. Just stop and think, what's this character like? What's the author telling me here? That's the point of brainstorming this. I want you to try to keep practicing, pausing and just thinking. Think about the characters. What's the author telling me here? Always do that. And then I just showed you how I just brainstormed some ideas right here. And as we read, we're going to find out more information if these ideas are actually true or false about the character. Okay, so let's keep going. The great day arrived. Mr. Button hurried to the hospital one morning in September for news of his wife and baby. When he was close to the Maryland private hospital, he saw the family doctor on the front steps. There was a serious look on the doctor's face, and this worried Mr. Button. And as always, if I'm reading too fast or too slow for you, you can pause the video, take your time reading this. I just kind of am reading this at a decent pace to keep us moving along here. But the question I'd like you to think about now is, what is the narrator most likely referring to in the first sentence? So the first sentence says, the great day arrived, period. So what great day? What is the writer talking about here? What's the narrator telling us here? Pause the video, think about that, come up with your answer. It's an open-ended question here, and then once you've thought about this, have your own answer, we'll move on. Okay, great. So the answer is most likely it's the baby being born. It says the great day arrived. Goes on to say that he's going to the hospital. for news of his wife and baby. We already know from earlier in the story that they're expecting a baby, so that's what I would say here. This question is just designed to really just get you thinking, kind of introduce you to making inferences. This wasn't really that hard of an inference. If you struggled with this one, don't worry about it, but there's going to be harder inferences as we get through here, but I'm just trying to get you to start making inferences here, start inferring, just making educated guesses about what's going on in the text. Okay, so the next question says, what inference can you make from the last sentence in the paragraph? And I have given you multiple choice answers for this. I also highlighted the sentence I'm talking about on the screen. There was a serious look on the doctor's face and this worried Mr. Button. So you have answer choices A, B, C, and D. So I'd like you to pause the video here, try to come up with the answer to this, and then as always, we're going to go over it. Okay. So great job for pausing. I know this is tedious. I know this, you'd probably rather be doing something else, but I promise you there is a point to this. We're answering questions here. A lot of these are, research-based things that are going to help boost your reading comprehension. We'll get into that more in a minute, but the answer here is B, that there's something wrong with Mr. Button. And really, the first says the baby was born healthy and Mrs. Button is doing well. Well, if that was true, why would the doctor have a serious look, and why would that look be worrying Mr. Button? Mr. Button succeeded at a new business venture. It doesn't tell us anything about his business so far in the story. It implies that maybe he's wealthy, that he's important, but doesn't really tell us that. Then it goes on to say the doctor is retiring, and the reason why this is probably not the best inference, this is not the best inference you could make, and the reason is because, based off of our critical thinking and our logic, what's going on here, the topic so far is the baby and that there's a baby coming, and the doctor has a serious look on his face. It's worrying Mr. Button. So probably the reason for this is that there's something wrong with the baby or with his wife. Okay, let's keep going here. And so you'll see a blank on the screen here. And that was done intentional. I'll explain why intentionally. I'll explain why in just a second. He ran toward the door. Dr. Keene, he called. Oh, Dr. Keene. The doctor heard him and turned around. He saw Mr. Button, and a blank look came over his face. What happened? Asked Mr. Button. What was it? How is she? A boy? What? Talk sense, said the doctor, a little angrily. Is the child born? Asked Mr. Button. Dr. Keene didn't answer immediately. Yes, he said slowly. A strange birth. Okay, so the first question here from this part of the story is, in the first sentence, who ran toward the doctor? It says he ran toward the doctor. Who is he talking about here? Pause the video, open-ended question, think about it, and we'll go over it. So the answer here is Mr. Button. Okay, so next, remember I told you about that blank? Well, basically, the reason I put a blank in is it's a method called Cloze tasks, and there's all this evidence showing that it can help with your reading comprehension. I have some data on screen from studies. I'm not going to show you, I'm not going to read all this, but I'm just telling you there is a reason why I have this blanked out here. It's an exercise called Cloze, and it's proven to help boost your reading comprehension. So we're going to practice with cloze deletions here in this video. But basically, the next question I have for you is, which word best fits the blank above? And I've highlighted the blank, so I'd like you to read the sentence. In fact, I'll read it for you for the first time we do this. It says, he saw Mr. Button and a blank look came over his face. So look at those four choices down below and tell me which word best belongs here, which word best fits. Okay, so the correct word would be curious, and number one, in the title of the piece, it's the curious case of Benjamin Button. So the word curious, the word in the title could be a clue, but also it says strange here, and you would just have to know, just kind of reason your way through this. Hopefully you found that curious would be the word that best fits here. A sick look, it could make sense, but it's asking which word best fits, and I think curious definitely best fits here. It wouldn't make sense for it to be a normal look, right? Because he says what happened, blah, 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 goes on to say that it was a strange birth, so it's not normal here. And professional, I don't think fits this context, so hopefully you saw that B was the right answer, but if not, don't worry about it. We're here to learn. So the passage goes on to say, is my wife all right? Yes. Is it a boy or a girl? Go and see, replied Dr. Keene. He still seems strangely angry. Terrible. One more case like this will finish me in medicine. So the next question says, when buying a new car, which of the following would Dr. Keene most likely consider? based on the information in the passage? A, the cost. B, how well the car would perform in the winter. C, how impressive the car would seem to others. Or D, how durable the car is. So you know the drill by now. Pause the video, think about this, and then as always, we'll go over it. Okay, so what I want you to see here, and this is another example of making an inference, the answer is C. And the reason why this would be the best guess here is because he seems very concerned and angry about the case and how it would affect his reputation. Seems more concerned about his appearance and reputation than the well-being of Mr. Button. And so we can infer that he would care more about his reputation and how the car would make him look than other things like the cost or how well it would perform in the winter. So that's just another example of an inference. All right, so moving right along here. What's the matter? Is there a blank with the baby? Asked Mr. Button. Go and see them, said Dr. Keene. And then get yourself another doctor. I brought you into the world, young man, and I've looked after your blank for 40 years. But this is the end. I don't want to see you or any of your relatives ever again. Goodbye. So the first question here, it's another Cloze deletion. It says, which word best fits the first blank here? And I've given you a list of 4 words. Cost, timing, problem, and place. So pause the video, take your time with this, try to guess which word best fits here, and know that when you're doing this right now, this is a proven method to help you with your reading comprehension. So what you're doing here, this is really valuable to you. Pause the video, try this out, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so the correct answer here is problem. And the reason why this would make sense is because it says, what's the matter here? Someone's asking what's the matter, which indicates there's probably some kind of problem. You also would just have to think, is there a problem with the baby? Is there a cost with the baby? Is there a timing? Is there a place? Well, problem seems to fit the context of what's going on here the best. Okay, so the next is, which word fits in the second blank here? Dog, baby, airplane, or family. Pause the video, try to figure this out, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so the answer here is family. You could think about this logically. You could say, could you look after a dog for 40 years? Well, sadly, a dog's not going to live that long. I've looked after your baby for 40 years. Well, we know that this is his first baby. It said in the opening that this was the Button family's first baby. Also, if it was a baby, the baby wouldn't live 40 years, so it's not talking about a baby here. And airplanes haven't been mentioned so far in the passage, so an airplane it wouldn't be the best choice here as a best guess. And so family is going to be the right word here, and you could do that by process of elimination, or you could see the word relatives and know that relatives, people you're related to, that has to do with family. So hopefully you found that D was the right answer, but if not, good try anyway. And let's keep going. So it says, and without another word, he turned and walked away. Mr. Button stood there on the sidewalk, feeling very worried and afraid. Something terrible has happened, he thought. Now, he didn't want to go into the hospital, but he walked slowly up the steps and through the entrance doors. A nurse was sitting behind a desk. Good morning, she said, smiling. Good morning. I am Mr. Roger Button. A look of fear came over the girl's face. She stood up, clearly planning to run away. Then she calmed herself and sat down again. I want to see my child, said Mr. Button. The nurse gave a little scream. Oh, of course, upstairs. Go upstairs, she said quickly. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video now and tell me what is the setting of this part of the story. So take your time, read this, take all the time you need, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so the setting now is inside the hospital. And what I really wanted you to see here is, again, setting is a pivotal skill for reading and understanding fiction. Probably can count on getting at least one, if not more, questions on the GED asking you specifically something about the setting in a story. But whether or not you get a question about what is the setting, the bigger issue here is that to understand any fictional story or some nonfiction pieces, you have to identify the setting. And especially pay attention to whenever the setting changes. So there's like the big setting, which in this case it's Baltimore, it's in the city, it's in the summer during that year. I think it was 1860 or something like that. So we already know that this is in Baltimore, right, in the city. But right now it's telling us specifically this next scene is set in the hospital in Baltimore, right? So again, this is going to help you picture what's happening here because they've talked about the hospital. and he was outside of the hospital, and now the next scene is in the hospital. So when you're forming the mental picture in your head of what's going on, which of course you should be doing if you're good at visualizing, not everybody is, but if you can, definitely try to create a mental picture of what's going on. And you want to picture this taking place in the hospital now, because that's where the setting has changed. So just a little note here to pay attention to the setting, and especially note where the setting is changing, because a lot of people get lost when they're reading. They get lost and they stumble with reading comprehension because they can't keep track of where the things are taking place in the story, partly because it's hard for them to figure out, hard for them to create a mental picture of what's going on, but it's hard for them to create that mental picture in many cases because they miss where it tells you that a setting is changing. Okay, so if someone's outside, then they're in the hospital, and you miss that detail and you're still picturing the story taking place outside somewhere, like just out in the middle of a city or something, it's probably not going to make a whole lot of sense what's happening. So this is why setting is really important. So we went over this, what's the setting of this part of the story. So the next question here, I've highlighted this right here. It says, she pointed to the stairs and Mr. Button turned away from the desk. He went upstairs and found another nurse. She was carrying a large metal bowl. I'm Mr. Button, he began nervously. I want to see my... Clank. The nurse dropped the blank. It fell down the stairs, one step at a time, and landed with a loud noise at the bottom. So what I have here, this is the passage continuing on here, and then this is the question that I wanted you to answer about this part here. Got my slides a little out of order, but this is the continuation of the passage, and I've highlighted the part of the passage that this question is asking about, so you don't have to click anywhere else in the video. You can answer the question based off of this text. So pause the video, and I want you to answer the question, which word was Mr. Button most likely going to say to finish his sentence? So think about that now. Okay, so the answer here is baby, and simply put, the reason why I would guess it would be baby is because it says, I want to see my doctor. Well, remember, he just saw the doctor. He saw the doctor outside of the hospital already, so the doctor is gone. In fact, the doctor said he doesn't want to see him anymore. Desk, well, I want to see my desk. Well, it mentions a desk, but it's saying that that's the nurse's desk, right? That's where the nurse is. It's not Mr. Button's desk, so he wouldn't say, I want to see my desk, all right? It could be, I want to see my wife. So if you guess D, I would say that is a very good guess, but I would still say that baby is probably what he was going to say, and the reason is because if we go back here, earlier on in the passage, he was saying, I want to see my child and stuff, and just if you just generally understand what's going on here in the story, is he's going in the hospital, he's going around to the nurses, asking about his child here mainly, and so that's what I'd want you to see here. But if you guessed his wife, I can see why you would think that. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's wrong, but the best answer I would say would be C. So this is just another general tip for multiple choice answers on the test. When multiple answer choices seem like they could be right, you want to go with whichever one seems most right. All right. So in this case, it could be the wife, it could be the baby, but I think that here it's pretty clear he's talking about the baby, just because the general plot of the story and what's happening at this point is he's going around asking about the baby. He's expressed some concern about his wife, but I think it's mainly the baby is what he was going to talk about here. All right, and so the next question, it says, which word most likely belongs in the blank? So I've highlighted the specific blank I'm talking about here, but where it says clank, the nurse dropped the blank. So pause the video now. So I'd like you to pause the video now and just think about this. What word best fits in the blank? And then we'll go over it. Okay, so the correct answer is the bowl, right? So it's not going to be the desk. It says, number one, it says she's carrying a large metal bowl. And then really the sound effect here is what hopefully will be an indication here. It says clank, and that's a sound effect. So, if you're picturing what's happening here, he runs into the nurse, she's carrying a bowl. She drops it, right? It says she dropped the blank, and it's making this clanking sound, right? So you can kind of form a movie in your head of picture what's happening and just kind of hear in your head that clanking sound of something hitting the ground, right? A desk could make a clanking sound, but usually it's going to be something metal, which we already know this has something to do with the metal bowl. It also says it fell down the stairs one step at a time, landed with a loud noise at the bottom. A desk probably wouldn't fall that way because it's too big. It could though, I suppose. I guess it could roll all the way down, but anyway. And the baby, it says the nurse dropped the baby. It fell down the stairs one step at a time. Well, if it was a baby, it probably wouldn't be making a loud noise at the bottom. It would probably be crying because it would be seriously injured by falling down the stairs. So that's not the right answer. Also, that clanking sound, a baby's not going to make a clanking sound. A baby would just be crying or something like that. And they're also looking for the baby. So the answer here is C. It's going to be the bowl. Okay, so the next passage continues. I want to see my child, Mr. Button shouted. All right, Mr. Button, the nurse agreed in a quiet voice. All right, but it's terrible. We're all feeling, well, nobody will want to use the hospital again after this. Hurry, Mr. Button cried. I can't wait any longer. Come this way, Mr. Button. So the question for this part is, in addition to the baby, Mr. and Mrs. Button and the narrator, how many other characters have been introduced at this point in the story? And the reason I'm asking you to think about this question now is, other than not keeping track of the setting, another reason why people have trouble with reading comprehension, particularly as fiction, is keeping track of all the characters. It's hard to keep track of them all in your head. We've already know that there's going to be a baby in the story. There's the narrator could be a character, and we definitely know about Mr. and Mrs. Button. But besides those four that we already talked about, how many other characters were introduced at this point in the story? And unfortunately, you might have to go back and review parts of this, which you can rewind the video and do that if you'd like to. But just try to remember off the top of your head. Just try to remember off the top of your head if you'd like to too, and we'll go over it. Okay, so whether you look back at the earlier parts of the video or if you remember this, it was the doctor and those two nurses. So he ran into the doctor quickly. The doctor had a worried look on his face. The doctor was angry. He ran into the first nurse, and then he ran into the second nurse. Remember, the second nurse dropped that bowl. So it's always good to keep track of the characters, especially when new characters are being introduced. And a really, really easy way to know how much attention, so to speak, to give to a certain character is to think about, is this character a main character or a supporting character? We'll come back to that in just a second. The next question I want you to answer is, which of the following best summarizes the main conflict in the story up until this point? A. Mr. Button is struggling to afford the cost of childcare. B. Mr. Button's doctor refuses to see him in the future. Or C. Mr. Button's wife had a baby and there's a problem with the baby. So pause the video, try to figure this out, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so basically, first off, A, we should eliminate that because it says Mr. Button is struggling to afford the cost of childcare. Well, there was nothing about that mentioned in the story, so we can take that out. So that would leave us with B or C. And so what I want you to see here is that in certain questions, some of the answer choices will be information that is correct, right? The doctor did refuse to see him in the future. That did happen earlier in the story, okay? But we shouldn't fall for that as the correct answer because that's not the main conflict, all right? The majority of this piece has been about how, his wife had a baby. There's some kind of problem with the baby, right? He's ran into the doctor. The doctor is expressing worry and concern. Both of the nurses are concerned. The one nurse is so concerned she's dropping a metal thing about it. So there's clearly the main conflict, which has came up several times throughout this, is there's a baby, there's something wrong with the baby, and so hopefully you saw that was the right answer here. If you guessed B, then you were on the right track because you remembered something that happened earlier in the story, right? His doctor did refuse to see him, but that's maybe a conflict in the story. It's one conflict, but it's not the main conflict. The main conflict is something that is going to come up again and again and again. It's like the central driving force of the story. So you might get a question on the GED test on RLA that asks you something like this, that might say, which of the following best summarizes the main conflict in the story, and gives you multiple answer choices. But I'm just giving you this tip right now. This is really valuable. Is while you're reading the passage, every now and then, I might have said this already in the video. I can't remember now if I said this, but pause and just ask yourself, do I understand what's going on? And just summarize things in your head. Pause the video, or as you're going through the test. You don't have to pause the video right now, but as you're going through the test, I want you to pause on your test and just think in your head. Just take 30 seconds. Just summarize what's happening in the story, because oftentimes this can be the difference between falling for a junk answer choice or being stuck on questions. Because when you're stuck on questions, you've got 4 different multiple choice answer choices, right? And they all are giving you all this different information, and most people do is they go back and forth. They look at the passage, go right to the answer choice and back to the passage, and they kind of glance back and forth. But what you really want to do is just slow down, take a deep breath, read a paragraph or two and pause and put in your own words. Do this in your head. I suppose you could write it out on scratch paper, or a scratch board, scratch pad that you'll get at the test if you take it in person. But that might eat up a lot of clock to do that. So that's why I'm saying to do it in your head. But just get in the habit of pausing and just think, how would I summarize this? How would I explain this to somebody else? And I'm telling you, if you get in the habit of doing that, you're gonna fall for a bunch of junk answers a lot less. Like, you're gonna be able to get a lot more questions right, because you're going to, that's what they're asking you to do. They want you to comprehend and understand. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to read and, put what you read in your own words. And obviously you can't do that out loud, but you can certainly do it in your head. And I know it sounds like it's going to take up more time to do that, but I'm telling you, you want to practice doing it to get the pacing right, because you don't want to take too much time to do it. But at the same time, if you spend more time just pausing briefly, thinking about what's happening, asking, do I understand this? Can I put it in my own words? And if you can't, you need to go back and read and make sure that the part that you're not understanding is clear. Because I'm telling you, when you've got all those answer choices right there, and like you're freaking out a little bit because you're not sure which is the correct answer, you are probably having that problem because you didn't understand the part of the passage that the question is about. All right, and so we've covered mainly these three skills here. I just talked about conflict and problem. The first thing you always want to establish whenever you're reading, what's the setting? You might get questions on that, but whether or not you get questions on the setting, it's important to note, because it's going to help you picture what's happening in the story and help you follow along. Keeping track of the characters is really, really important, but so is figuring out the main conflict or problem in the story. Now, there could be several different conflicts, several different problems and issues going on, but there's usually one main central problem or conflict. And that's something that you want to identify, because you want to try to think about that as you're reading ahead of time, because you're almost certainly going to get a question about that. Okay, so the next question. Based on the information given so far, which type of character is Mr. Button? Is he a main character or is he a supporting character? Pause the video, think about this, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so the answer here is that so far I would say he's definitely a main character, right? Every single scene in the story, he's had a role in this. He's definitely a main character. Definitely A is the right answer here. And so this is just another note here, figure out that setting, keep track of the characters. And when you've got 7 or 8 or 9 different characters to juggle, here I think we're up to 7 characters already. The baby, the Mr. and Mrs. Button, the narrator possibly is going to be a character. Then also there's the doctor and the 2 nurses so far. That's 7 characters, I think, if I'm doing math off the top of my head correctly. That's a lot to keep track of, right? And so how do you keep track of them? You could write them all down, write bullet points down. Might take up a lot of time on your test, and you might not be able to do that if you're taking it online. I've heard people can't use online scratch papers right now. If you're doing it online, that might change in the future, but if you're going in person, believe you're going to have a whiteboard, but it might take up too much time to do that. But what you can do, though, is think, is this character a main character or a supporting character? If it's a main character, it's hopefully pretty obvious Mr. Button is the main character so far at this point of the story, because he's in every single scene. This whole thing is centered around him and his problem being there's a baby born, there's some issue with it. He's trying to find out what the issue is, but just by knowing that he's a main character, that should tell you that this is a character to pay attention to. All right, the nurses, you want to pay attention to all the characters, but the nurses and the doctors have, there've been that one doctor and there've been the nurses, but, the nurses have had a small role in the story. They haven't been central characters in the story so far. It's been mainly all about Mr. Button. So, again, you want to pay attention to all the other characters, but you want to kind of rank in your mind, figure out which ones are the main characters. Those are who you want to pay attention to. You're most likely to get questions about the main characters instead of the secondary characters or the supporting characters. Although everything is fair game on the test, so you could get a question about a nurse or the doctor, which I gave you some of those examples, but, to try to figure out the characters, one way to keep track of them is to divide them up into main and supporting. Pay more attention to the main characters. The supporting characters, be aware of them, but typically not going to be as important to know, all right? And of course there's exceptions, but I'm just giving you a general rule of thumb, all right? And so I already gave this answer away basically, but, based on the information so far, which type of characters are the nurses? And I already basically said they're supporting characters. Some people will call them secondary characters, but it's not always obvious at first who's a main character and who's a supporting character, right? For example, the baby might end up being a main character later on, or it could turn out that the baby is really just a supporting character that's only mentioned in the beginning of the story and then goes away. Mrs. Button, it's not really clear, is she a main character or a supporting character? I would say, she's kind of a main character because, she's having the baby, but so far she's only been mentioned really once or twice throughout the story. So I would have to honestly say she's a supporting character, although she could turn into a main character later on. So it's not always clear right off the bat if someone's a main or a supporting character, so just keep that in mind. But throughout the story, if a character is appearing again and again and again, especially if they've got a main problem and the main conflict in the story has to do with that character, it's probably, chances are it's probably the main character. So pay more attention to that main character. Okay, so it goes on to say here, "I want to see my child," Mr. Button shouted. "All right, Mr. Button," the nurse agreed in a quiet voice. "All right. But it's terrible. We're all feeling, well, nobody will want to use the hospital again after this." "Hurry," Mr. Button cried. "I can't wait any longer. Come this way, Mr. Button." So the question here is, what do you think is wrong with the baby? And there's no right or wrong answers. I'd just like you to pause and just think, what do I think is going on with the baby? Based off of what I read, is there something, is there some kind of clue, or is there some mystery that's, the pieces have all been laid out here, it just hasn't been spelled out for us yet? Or maybe there's not, maybe it hasn't been revealed yet. But I'd like you to just think about this. There's no right or wrong answers. Just pause the video. It's just going to help you with your metacognition, fancy word for thinking about thinking. But just to help you with your reading comprehension and just to help get you thinking about the story. Because pausing, even while you're reading, just thinking about the story, it's going to help you process it on a deeper level, which is going to help you get more questions right, because you'll understand the passage. The questions are all going to be about the passage, obviously. So the more you understand the passage, the easier the questions are going to be for you. Okay, so like I said, there's no right or wrong answer for that one, so we're going to move right along here. Around the wall, okay, so here's the next part. It says, Mr. Button followed the nurse. There was a sound of babies crying. This grew louder until they stopped outside a room. The nurse pushed the door open and they went in. Around the walls were white blank, each one with a name tied to the top. "Well," said Mr. Button, "which is mine?" "There," said the nurse. "So I want you to answer which word best fits in the blank. Chairs, cribs, ribbons, or cans." Pause the video, think about this, and then we'll go over it. Okay, so hopefully you see that B, cribs, is the correct answer. So you see words like babies here, you see words like white, like typically a crib's going to be white, although not always, but typically from most cribs that I've seen. And so you just kind of have to think, would chairs make sense here? Would ribbons make sense here? Would cans make sense here? And hopefully you see, using the context clues, that cribs is going to be the right answer. Okay, so it says, Mr. Button's eyes followed her pointing finger. And this is what he saw. An old man of about 70 years old sat in one of the cribs. His hair was almost white, and he had a long gray beard. His feet hung over one end of the crib, and his head and arms hung over the other. He was wearing only a large white blanket. He looked at Mr. Button with a question in his eyes. "Am I crazy?" Mr. Button shouted angrily at the nurse. "Is this some terrible hospital joke?" "It doesn't seem like a joke to us," said the nurse angrily. "And I don't know if you're crazy or not, but there's no mistake. That is your child." Okay, so please summarize the last three paragraphs in your own words. So by the last three paragraphs, I mean what's going on right here, this one, and this one, all right? And again, this is honestly probably might be the most important skill, is being able to put things in your own words. And, if you can summarize something, if you can put something in your own words, that's going to tell you if you understand it or not. And again, if you try to put this in your own words, you realize that you can't do it, or you're having trouble doing that, you might not understand it well enough. So in that case, you'd want to reread this until you at least have a better idea of what's happening, okay? So just imagine too, if you watched a TV show, whatever your favorite TV shows are, you watch a TV show and the next day, you go to work or you see a friend and your friend says, "I missed that show last night. What happened?" And you would put in your own words what happened in the show. So that's kind of what I'm asking you to do right here. And again, if I could just get people to start doing this as you're reading the passages on your test, just pause from now and then, take 20 or 30 seconds while you're reading, on your test, to just pause and just think in your head, what's happening right now? Just put it in your own words. And I know it feels like that's going to take up more time on the test. And it will if you take too long. If you take like 5 minutes to do this every paragraph, you're going to run out of time and you'll probably fail. But if you practice doing this and if you do it, it's probably going to save you time because you're going to understand what's happening more and understand it better. So you can pause the video, try to summarize the last 3 paragraphs. This is one of the most important skills to get out of this whole video, so it really would encourage you to do this. I know not everyone watching this will do it, but I'm telling you, I'm saying this for a reason. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to do that. But my summary would be this. Mr. Button was expecting to see a baby, but instead he found an old man sitting in the crib, and he's in disbelief, and the nurse confirms it's his baby. So if you got anything like that out of this, then your summary is probably going to look a lot different, but as long as you got those main ideas, you probably did fine summarizing it. And so here we have the passage continuing. The old man looked calmly at the nurse and then at Mr. Button. "Are you my father?" he asked. "Because if you are, please get me out of this place. It's very blank." "Where did you come from? Who are you?" screamed Mr. Button. So pause the video. I know I've been reading some of these kind of fast because I want to keep the video moving along here, but I encourage you to take all the time you need to read and think about this. So think about this and then we'll go over it. So the correct answer here is uncomfortable. Okay, so hopefully you saw that B is the right answer here. It's very uncomfortable. So thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope this was helpful. I hope that you took away things that you can use on your GED test. Just remember, if you can put something in your own words, that means that you understand it. If you can do that throughout your test, just pause, take a little bit of time to do that. I think it's really going to help you because once you see those questions and you see those answer choices and you're not sure what to do,